The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at her bedroom window, her reflection pale against the ancient glass.
9 months had passed since the world last saw her smile genuinely in public.
9 months since whispers began echoing through the corridors of power, through the tabloid newsrooms, and across social media platforms worldwide. Where was the future queen? What was the palace hiding? Behind her, on the mahogany desk that had once belonged to Queen Victoria, lay a manila folder containing documents that would either restore her reputation or bring down the very foundations of the British monarchy. Inside were medical reports, private correspondence, and photographic evidence that told a story the public had never heard. A story of betrayal, manipulation, and a cover-up that reached the highest levels of government. Catherine's fingers trembled slightly as she touched the window frame. In just 3 hours, she would walk into the most important press conference of her life, flanked by the only people she could trust: her devoted protection officer Sarah Mitchell, her childhood friend Emma Thompson, and surprisingly, her former rival Meghan Markle, who had flown in from California with shocking revelations of her own. The palace had underestimated Catherine's resolve. They thought 9 months of silence meant submission. They were wrong. Today, the future Queen of England would prove that some truths are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Today, she would show the world what really happened during those missing months and why the palace had been so desperate to keep her hidden away. The game of royal chess was about to change forever, and Catherine held all the right pieces. Catherine Middleton had always known that marrying into the royal family would mean sacrificing her privacy, but she never imagined it would cost her nearly everything she held dear. The woman who once laughed freely at university parties and dreamed of working in art history now found herself trapped in a gilded cage, every movement scrutinized, every word measured against centuries of protocol. The trouble began in March 2024, during what should have been a routine charity visit to a children's hospital in Manchester. Catherine had been feeling unwell for weeks, experiencing severe headaches and unexplained fatigue that left her struggling to maintain her usual composed demeanor. That morning, as she bent down to speak with a young cancer patient, the world suddenly tilted sideways. The cameras captured her stumbling, her face pale as parchment, before her protection officers rushed to steady her. Within hours, the footage was everywhere. Social media exploded with speculation about her health, her marriage, and her fitness to be the future queen. The palace's initial response was swift and brutal in its efficiency. A brief statement mentioned a minor stomach ailment, and Catherine was immediately whisked away to a private medical facility in Switzerland, far from the prying eyes of the British press. What the public didn't know was that Catherine's collapse had revealed something far more sinister than a simple illness. Dr. Boster, James Harrison, her longtime personal physician, discovered traces of a rare toxin in her bloodstream during routine tests. The substance, virtually undetectable without specific testing, had been slowly poisoning her for months. Someone with access to her food, her drinks, or her personal items had been systematically attempting to harm her. The revelation sent shockwaves through the inner circle of the royal family. King Charles, still adjusting to his new role as monarch, ordered an immediate and highly classified investigation. The task fell to Detective Inspector Margaret Stone, a seasoned investigator known for her discretion and her success in solving high-profile cases involving public figures. Stone's investigation began with Catherine's daily routine. Every person who had regular contact with the princess was quietly questioned and background checked. The list was surprisingly short, but included some of the most trusted individuals in the royal household: her private secretary, her chef, her ladies-in-waiting, and her security detail. As Catherine recovered in the Swiss clinic, isolated from everyone except her closest family members, she began to piece together disturbing patterns from the past year. There had been subtle changes in the behavior of certain staff members, unexplained absences, and small incidents that seemed innocent at the time but now took on a more ominous meaning. Her protection officer, Sarah Mitchell, had been by Catherine's side for over 5 years. A former SAS operative with an impeccable record, Sarah had saved Catherine from 2 previous security threats and had earned her complete trust. It was Sarah who first voiced what everyone was thinking but nobody dared to say. This wasn't the work of a random stalker or an outside terrorist group. This was an inside job. The Swiss clinic became Catherine's temporary fortress, but even there she couldn't escape the growing media storm. British tabloids ran increasingly wild speculation about her condition. Some claimed she was suffering from a mental breakdown. Others suggested marital problems with Prince William. The most cruel rumours hinted at substance abuse or an eating disorder. Prince William found himself in an impossible position. Protocol demanded that he maintain public duties while his wife recovered, but every public appearance without Catherine by his side only fueled more speculation. The strain showed in his increasingly gaunt appearance and the tense set of his jaw during official photographs. Meanwhile, Detective Inspector Stone's investigation was yielding disturbing results. Financial records showed that 3 members of Catherine's household staff had received significant and unexplained payments over the past 18 months. Phone records revealed encrypted communications with known associates of foreign intelligence services. The most shocking discovery came when Stone examined the security footage from Catherine's private apartments. Advanced digital analysis revealed that her morning coffee had been tampered with on at least 12 occasions over a 6-month period. The perpetrator was careful, professional, and had intimate knowledge of the security protocols. As Catherine's health slowly improved under the careful supervision of Dr. Harrison and a team of toxicology specialists, she made a decision that would change everything. She would not return to London as the compliant, silent victim the palace expected. She would find out who had tried to destroy her, and she would make sure they faced justice, regardless of the consequences to the monarchy's reputation. Her first call was to Emma Thompson, her oldest friend from their university days at St. Andrews. Emma, now a successful investigative journalist with The Guardian, had maintained their friendship despite the pressures of Catherine's royal role. Emma's response was immediate and unwavering. She would help Catherine uncover the truth, no matter where it led. Emma's investigation began with the financial irregularities Stone had discovered. Using her network of contacts in banking and intelligence circles, she traced the mysterious payments back to a shadowy organization with connections to several European governments. The amounts were substantial enough to compromise anyone with financial difficulties, but small enough to avoid triggering automatic banking alerts. The organization, operating under the innocuous name European Cultural Exchange Foundation, had been funneling money to influencers, journalists, and public figures across Europe for nearly a decade. Their goal appeared to be destabilizing confidence in traditional institutions, including constitutional monarchies. Catherine's poisoning wasn't an isolated incident. Emma discovered that similar attacks had been carried out against the spouses of prominent political figures in Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium. The pattern was always the same: a slow-acting toxin that would cause the victim to appear unstable or unhealthy, followed by media campaigns designed to destroy their credibility and public standing. Back in London, the absence of any official updates about Catherine's condition was creating a crisis for the monarchy. Public support for the royal family had been declining for years, and Catherine's mysterious disappearance was accelerating that trend. Opinion polls showed that a majority of British citizens now questioned the transparency and honesty of the palace's communications. King Charles found himself caught between his loyalty to his daughter-in-law and the demands of his advisors, who insisted that any revelation about the poisoning would create a national security crisis and potentially destabilize the government. The Prime Minister had been quietly briefed on the situation and had made it clear that the investigation must remain classified indefinitely. But Catherine was no longer the uncertain young woman who had married into the royal family 13 years earlier. Her ordeal had stripped away her remaining illusions about the institution she had pledged to serve. She understood now that her value to the palace was entirely dependent on her ability to smile, wave, and never ask difficult questions. The moment she became a liability, she would be sacrificed without hesitation. Dr. Harrison's final medical report confirmed that Catherine had been deliberately poisoned with a compound designed to cause neurological symptoms that would mimic mental illness or substance abuse. The dosage had been carefully calculated to avoid immediate life-threatening effects, but to create a pattern of behavior that would destroy her public credibility over time. Armed with this medical evidence and Emma's investigative findings, Catherine made her decision. She would return to London, but not as the silent victim the palace expected. She would expose the truth about her poisoning and the broader conspiracy behind it, regardless of the consequences to herself or the monarchy. Her return journey to England was planned with military precision. Sarah Mitchell coordinated with a select group of trusted security personnel to ensure Catherine's safety from the moment she left the Swiss clinic until she reached a secure location in London. They knew that whoever had tried to poison her once would certainly try again if they discovered she was preparing to speak publicly. The drive through the English countryside felt surreal to Catherine. After 9 months away, everything looked the same, but she felt fundamentally changed by her ordeal. The naive trust she had once placed in the institution of the monarchy had been replaced by a steely determination to protect herself and her family from those who would exploit their positions for political gain. As their convoy approached London, Catherine reviewed the evidence that would soon shake the foundations of the British establishment. Medical records, financial documents, surveillance footage, and witness statements painted a clear picture of a conspiracy that reached far beyond a simple attempt on her life. This was about power, influence, and the willingness of certain individuals to commit any crime to achieve their political objectives. The palace had no idea what was coming. They expected Catherine to return quietly, accept whatever cover story they had prepared, and resume her royal duties without asking uncomfortable questions. They had underestimated the woman she had become during those months of isolation and investigation. Catherine's phone buzzed with a message from an unexpected source. Meghan Markle, her former sister-in-law who had left the royal family amid her own controversies, had been following the news coverage of Catherine's disappearance. Meghan's message was brief but significant. "I have information that might help. Similar things happened to me. We need to talk." The message opened up a new dimension to Catherine's understanding of her situation. If Meghan had experienced similar treatment, it suggested a pattern of behavior within the royal establishment that went beyond her individual case. It meant that the conspiracy she was uncovering might be even larger and more systematic than she had imagined. As the lights of London appeared on the horizon, Catherine felt a mixture of fear and determination. Tomorrow she would begin the most dangerous phase of her plan, gathering the allies she would need to survive what was coming. She knew that once she started asking questions publicly, there would be no turning back. The palace held its breath, but not for the reasons they thought. They were waiting for their compliant princess to return and resume her role in their carefully orchestrated facade. Instead, they were about to face a woman who had survived an assassination attempt and discovered the truth about the institution she had served so faithfully. Catherine looked out at the city lights and made a silent promise to herself and to all the women who had been silenced by powerful institutions. Her voice would not be silenced. Her truth would be heard. And those responsible for trying to destroy her would face the consequences of their actions. The game was about to begin, and this time, Catherine intended to win. The Royal Institution's lecture hall had been chosen specifically for its symbolic significance. Founded in 1799 for the promotion of scientific knowledge and understanding, it represented everything Catherine believed the monarchy should stand for: truth, education, and service to the public good. As she stood behind the heavy oak doors listening to the murmur of hundreds of journalists and cameras being prepared, she drew strength from the building's noble history. Sarah Mitchell had transformed the venue into a fortress. Security personnel in plain clothes were positioned throughout the audience, and electronic countermeasures ensured that no unauthorized recording devices or weapons could enter the hall. The precautions were necessary given the threats that had been arriving through various channels since news of the press conference had leaked the night before. Emma Thompson stood beside Catherine, reviewing the final details of their media strategy. They had prepared for every possible response from the palace, from attempts to discredit Catherine's mental health to claims that she was being manipulated by foreign agents. Each potential attack had been anticipated and countered with documentary evidence and expert testimony. Dr. Harrison had arrived from Switzerland with additional medical evidence that would support Catherine's account. His analysis of hair and tissue samples showed clear proof of long-term poisoning with a compound that could only have been administered by someone with regular access to her food and personal items. The scientific evidence was irrefutable and had been independently verified by laboratories in 3 different countries. As the clock approached 10 o'clock, Catherine received an unexpected visitor. Detective Inspector Margaret Stone arrived with news that would add even more gravity to her revelations. The official police investigation had been terminated by order of the Home Secretary, despite clear evidence of criminal activity. Stone had been reassigned to a different case and warned not to pursue her inquiries into Catherine's poisoning. Stone's decision to attend the press conference despite official pressure demonstrated the extent to which the conspiracy had corrupted normal legal processes. Her presence would lend additional credibility to Catherine's account and show that even dedicated public servants were being silenced when they tried to investigate crimes committed by powerful individuals. The moment of truth arrived with startling suddenness. Emma nodded to Catherine, who took a final deep breath and walked through the doors into the bright lights and chaos of the press conference. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Camera flashes exploded like lightning, and the murmur of conversation died into absolute silence as hundreds of journalists realized they were witnessing a moment that would define British history. Catherine walked to the podium with the composed grace that had made her beloved by the public, but there was something different about her bearing. 9 months of isolation and investigation had stripped away the last traces of the uncertain young woman who had married into the royal family. The person standing before the world's media was someone who had faced death and discovered truths that powerful people had been willing to kill to protect. Her opening words were simple and direct, carrying the weight of absolute conviction. She thanked the media for their attendance and acknowledged that what she was about to reveal would be difficult for many people to accept. Then, without hesitation or emotion, she began to tell the story of her deliberate poisoning and the conspiracy behind it. The silence in the hall was profound as Catherine methodically presented her evidence. Medical reports confirmed the presence of synthetic toxins in her bloodstream. Financial records showed payments to conspirators from foreign intelligence sources. Audio recordings captured conversations between palace officials discussing the need to neutralize her influence. Surveillance footage showed her coffee being tampered with on multiple occasions. Each revelation built upon the previous one, creating an overwhelming case that could not be dismissed as delusion or manipulation. Catherine's presentation was factual, measured, and devastating in its implications. She was not making accusations based on suspicion or emotion. She was presenting documented proof of criminal conspiracy at the highest levels of British society. The journalists in the audience struggled to process what they were hearing. Many had covered the royal family for decades and thought they understood how the institution operated. Catherine's revelations shattered their assumptions and forced them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the monarchy and its relationship with the British government. When Catherine introduced Meghan Markle as a supporting witness, the shock in the room was palpable. Meghan's decision to return to Britain and support Catherine's revelations was seen by many as the ultimate vindication of her own experiences with the royal establishment. Her testimony about similar harassment and manipulation tactics provided crucial context for Catherine's more serious allegations. Meghan's evidence was particularly damaging because it showed a pattern of institutional behavior rather than an isolated incident. The palace had consistently used underhanded tactics against women who threatened their traditional power structures. The difference was that Catherine had survived a more direct and deadly form of attack. Harrison's medical testimony provided scientific credibility that made it impossible to dismiss Catherine's claims as fantasy or delusion. His detailed explanation of the poisoning process, supported by laboratory results and expert analysis, demonstrated beyond doubt that someone had deliberately and systematically attempted to destroy Catherine's health and credibility. Detective Inspector Stone's testimony was perhaps the most damaging to the establishment's credibility. Her account of being ordered to terminate a legitimate criminal investigation revealed the extent to which normal legal processes had been corrupted to protect the conspirators. Stone's reputation for integrity and professionalism made her allegations impossible to ignore. As Catherine presented each piece of evidence, the reactions from the audience became increasingly intense. Veteran journalists who had seen every kind of royal scandal were visibly shocked by the scope and severity of what they were hearing. Several broke protocol by calling out questions before Catherine had finished her presentation, but she remained focused and composed throughout. The international implications of Catherine's revelations became clear when she presented evidence of foreign involvement in the conspiracy. The European Cultural Exchange Foundation had been used as a vehicle for destabilizing Western institutions, and Britain had been a primary target. Catherine's poisoning was part of a broader campaign that had also targeted political figures in other democratic countries. Emma Thompson's investigative work had uncovered connections between the conspiracy and several major news organizations. The revelation that prominent royal correspondents had been receiving payments to manipulate their coverage created a media crisis that went far beyond the royal family. Public trust in journalism itself was now at stake. When Catherine finished her presentation, the questions from the media came in a torrent. She answered each one directly and comprehensively, never showing anger or emotion despite the personal nature of the attacks she had survived. Her composure in the face of such traumatic experiences only reinforced her credibility and made her accusations more compelling. The most dramatic moment came when a journalist asked about Prince William's knowledge of the conspiracy. Catherine paused for the first time during the press conference, and her pain was visible for just a moment before she regained her composure. She stated simply that her husband had been kept unaware of the details, but had been influenced by advisors who were part of the conspiracy. The implication was clear. Prince William had been manipulated into believing that Catherine's absence was necessary for her health and for the stability of the monarchy. He had been a victim of the same conspiracy that had nearly killed his wife, and his cooperation with the cover-up had been obtained through deception rather than active participation. As the press conference concluded, Catherine made a statement that would be quoted in history books for generations. She declared that she had not endured 9 months of isolation and investigation to settle personal scores, but to prevent similar attacks on other public figures who might not have the resources or support system to defend themselves. Her final words challenged the British people to demand better from their institutions and to never again accept secrecy and manipulation as normal aspects of governance. She reminded them that in a democracy, those who hold power must be held accountable for their actions regardless of their position or status. The immediate reaction to Catherine's revelations was unprecedented in modern British history. Social media exploded with support for her courage and demands for immediate investigations into her allegations. Opinion polls conducted within hours of the press conference showed overwhelming public support for her decision to speak out, but the establishment's response was swift and predictable. Within an hour of the press conference ending, Buckingham Palace released a statement expressing concern for Catherine's mental health and suggesting that she was being manipulated by individuals with ulterior motives. Government spokesmen hinted at national security implications that prevented full disclosure of the situation. The media war had begun, and Catherine knew that the next few days would determine whether her revelations led to meaningful reform or were successfully discredited by the same forces that had tried to destroy her. The battle for public opinion would be fierce, but she had advantages her opponents didn't expect. The evidence she had presented was too comprehensive and well documented to be easily dismissed. The international media attention meant that the story could not be buried through traditional British methods of news management. Most importantly, Catherine had demonstrated a level of courage and integrity that resonated with people who were tired of being lied to by their leaders. As Catherine left the lecture hall, surrounded by her loyal team of protectors and supporters, she knew that she had crossed a line from which there could be no return. Her life as a conventional royal was over, but her role as a voice for truth and justice was just beginning. The palace was no longer just holding its breath. The institution was fighting for its survival against a woman who had proven that some truths are worth any sacrifice to reveal. The outcome of that battle would determine not just the future of the British monarchy, but the relationship between power and accountability in democratic societies around the world. The 48 hours following Catherine's press conference transformed Britain into a nation in crisis. The revelations had shattered the carefully maintained facade of royal dignity and governmental competence that had defined British public life for decades. In Parliament, emergency sessions were called, as MPs demanded immediate investigations. On the streets, spontaneous protests erupted, as citizens expressed their outrage at the betrayal of their trust. Catherine had retreated to a secure location in the Cotswolds, a fortified country estate owned by Emma Thompson's family that had been hastily converted into a command centre for the battle ahead. The property's isolation provided security, while its extensive communication facilities allowed Catherine's team to coordinate their response to the establishment's counterattack. The palace's initial response had been clumsy and desperate. Their statement questioning Catherine's mental health had backfired spectacularly when Dr. Elizabeth Crawford released her comprehensive psychiatric evaluation proving Catherine's complete mental competence. Their suggestion that she was being manipulated by foreign agents collapsed when Emma Thompson provided documentation of her own British intelligence clearance and impeccable patriotic credentials. King Charles faced the most severe crisis of his brief reign. Within hours of Catherine's press conference, Republican movements across the Commonwealth had seized on her revelations to renew calls for the abolition of the monarchy. Opinion polls showed that public support for the royal family had plummeted to historic lows, with a majority of British citizens now believing that the institution was irredeemably corrupt. The government's position was equally precarious. Prime Minister Harrison had been privately briefed on aspects of the conspiracy months earlier, but had chosen to prioritise political stability over justice. His decision to suppress Detective Inspector Stone's investigation was now seen as evidence of his complicity in the cover-up. Calls for his resignation grew louder by the hour. International reaction to Catherine's revelations was swift and severe. The European Union announced an investigation into the activities of the European Cultural Exchange Foundation across all member states. The United States recalled its ambassador for consultations and hinted at diplomatic consequences if the British government failed to prosecute those responsible for the conspiracy. Sarah Mitchell had been monitoring intelligence communications and reported disturbing developments. Several of the individuals named in Catherine's evidence had suddenly left the country, despite police requests that they remain available for questioning. Financial assets were being moved through offshore accounts in patterns consistent with flight preparations. The most shocking revelation came when Thomas Kingsley received a message from a former colleague still working at the palace. Security footage from the previous night showed senior advisors removing boxes of documents from their offices and loading them into private vehicles. The systematic destruction of evidence was happening in real time, despite legal obligations to preserve all materials relevant to the investigation. Catherine realized that her revelations, devastating as they had been, represented only the beginning of the battle for justice. The conspiracy she had exposed was fighting back with all the resources and influence at its disposal. They were prepared to sacrifice anyone, including members of the royal family, to protect the core network of power and corruption she had threatened. Her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message that made her blood run cold. Prince William was requesting an immediate meeting, but the message contained coded phrases that Sarah recognized as distress signals. William was either under duress or had been compromised by his handlers. Either way, any meeting would be extremely dangerous. Emma Thompson burst into the room with news that changed everything. Her contacts at The Guardian had uncovered evidence of a planned character assassination campaign against Catherine that went far beyond anything they had anticipated. Fabricated evidence was being prepared to suggest that she had mental health issues, substance abuse problems, and even extramarital affairs. The sophistication of the disinformation campaign was staggering. Deepfake videos had been created showing Catherine in compromising situations. Medical records were being falsified to support claims of psychiatric instability. Social media accounts with millions of followers were being activated to spread coordinated lies about her credibility and motives. But Emma's investigation had also uncovered something that gave Catherine's team a crucial advantage. The disinformation campaign was being coordinated through the same communication channels used to organize her poisoning. Every message, every instruction, and every piece of fabricated evidence was being intercepted by intelligence services that had been secretly monitoring the conspiracy for months. Detective Inspector Stone arrived with news that vindicated Catherine's decision to go public. Her former colleagues in law enforcement had been quietly investigating the conspiracy, despite official orders to terminate their inquiries. They had gathered enough evidence to support criminal charges against dozens of individuals, including several members of Parliament and senior civil servants. The evidence Stone brought was devastating. Recorded conversations showed government ministers discussing the need to eliminate Catherine as a political threat. Financial records documented payments totaling millions of pounds to journalists, social media influencers, and even medical professionals who had participated in the conspiracy. Most damaging of all were communications between British officials and foreign intelligence services discussing the broader campaign to destabilize Western democratic institutions. Catherine's poisoning had been part of a coordinated effort that included similar operations in France, Germany, and the Netherlands. Dr. Harrison contacted Catherine with urgent news from Switzerland. The laboratory that had analyzed her blood samples had been burglarized, and several technicians had been threatened to discourage them from discussing their findings. The international nature of the intimidation campaign proved that the conspiracy had resources and reached far beyond anything they had previously imagined. Catherine's children had been quietly moved to a secure location by Sarah Mitchell's team after intelligence reports suggested they might be targeted for kidnapping or worse. The realization that innocent children were being threatened because of her decision to speak out filled Catherine with a cold fury that strengthened her resolve to see the conspiracy destroyed completely. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Marcus Wells, a former MI6 operative who had been recruited by the European Cultural Exchange Foundation, contacted Emma Thompson through encrypted channels. His conscience had been troubled by the escalation from political manipulation to attempted murder, and Catherine's courage in speaking out had inspired him to defect from the conspiracy. Wells brought with him a treasure trove of intelligence that revealed the full scope of the operation against Catherine and other targets. Code names, operational plans, financial records, and personal dossiers on dozens of political figures painted a picture of systematic subversion that threatened the foundation of democratic governance across Europe. The most shocking revelation in Wells's intelligence concerned Prince William's role in the conspiracy. He had not been an active participant, but he had been systematically manipulated by advisors who fed him false information about Catherine's mental state and loyalty to the monarchy. His cooperation with her isolation had been obtained through deception, making him another victim of the same forces that had tried to destroy his wife. Armed with Wells's intelligence and the evidence gathered by Stone's unofficial police investigation, Catherine's team prepared for the final phase of their campaign. They would present irrefutable proof, not just of her poisoning, but of a broader conspiracy that threatened democratic institutions across the Western world. The second press conference was scheduled for the following morning at the Houses of Parliament, a venue chosen to emphasize the constitutional implications of Catherine's revelations. Members of Parliament from all parties had demanded the opportunity to hear her evidence directly, and several had privately promised to call for immediate criminal investigations regardless of the political consequences. As Catherine prepared for what would be the most important public appearance of her life, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 9 months earlier, she had been a dutiful royal wife who trusted the institution she served. Now, she was a woman who understood that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty to one's country requires challenging its most powerful institutions. Sarah Mitchell completed the security arrangements for the parliamentary appearance, but her expression was grim. Intelligence reports indicated that desperate measures were being planned to prevent Catherine from presenting her evidence. The conspiracy was prepared to risk everything, including violence in the heart of the British government, to protect themselves from exposure. Emma Thompson reviewed the media strategy one final time. International news organizations had committed to carrying Catherine's parliamentary testimony live, ensuring that any attempts to suppress or distort her message would fail. The story had already gained momentum that no single government or institution could control. Dr. Crawford provided a final psychological evaluation that would counter any last-minute attempts to question Catherine's competence or credibility. Her assessment was unambiguous. Catherine was not only mentally stable, but demonstrated exceptional courage and integrity in the face of extraordinary pressure and danger. As midnight approached, Catherine stood at the window of the secure compound, looking out at the lights of London in the distance. Tomorrow, she would either achieve justice for herself and countless other victims of institutional corruption, or she would face destruction by forces that had already demonstrated their willingness to use any means necessary to protect their power. The palace was no longer holding its breath. The institution was fighting for its life against a woman who had proven that truth could triumph over power when courage and evidence combined. The outcome of tomorrow's confrontation would determine whether Britain remained a democracy governed by law or became an oligarchy controlled by those willing to commit any crime to maintain their position. Catherine touched the locket containing photographs of her children and made a silent promise. Whatever happened tomorrow, she would ensure that they inherited a country where truth mattered more than power, and where those who served the public could do so without fear of assassination or character destruction by those they threatened. The final battle was about to begin, and Catherine was ready to see it through to the end, regardless of the personal cost. She had survived assassination attempts, character assassination, and systematic betrayal by those she had trusted. Tomorrow she would find out if a single person with the truth could prevail against an entire system built on lies and corruption. The answer would determine not just her own fate, but the future of democratic governance in Britain and beyond. The morning of Catherine's parliamentary testimony dawned grey and cold, as if the weather itself reflected the gravity of what was about to unfold. Westminster Hall, the oldest building on the parliamentary estate and witness to nearly 1,000 years of British history, had been chosen as the venue for what many observers believed would be the most significant constitutional crisis since the English Civil War. Catherine arrived under extraordinary security arrangements. Armed police cordoned off a 6-block radius around Parliament, while specialist units swept every inch of Westminster Hall for explosives or surveillance devices. Sarah Mitchell had coordinated with intelligence services from 3 countries to ensure that no aspect of Catherine's safety had been overlooked. The scale of media attention was unprecedented. Over 400 journalists from around the world had been credentialed to attend, while billions more would watch through live television and internet broadcasts. The story had transcended British politics to become a global symbol of the struggle between institutional power and individual courage. Inside Westminster Hall, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Members of Parliament from all parties filled the ancient benches, many having cancelled other commitments to hear Catherine's testimony personally. The Speaker of the House had invoked rarely used parliamentary procedures to allow for simultaneous questioning by MPs and presentation of evidence in formats normally reserved for criminal trials. Catherine entered the hall accompanied by Emma Thompson, Dr. Harrison, Detective Inspector Stone, and Marcus Wells, the defected intelligence operative, whose evidence would prove crucial to her case. The sight of these 5 individuals walking together sent a clear message. This was not the testimony of a single person, but the coordinated revelation of a conspiracy that threatened the foundations of British democracy. Her opening statement was delivered with the calm authority of someone who had survived assassination attempts and emerged stronger. Catherine began by acknowledging the gravity of appearing before Parliament to accuse government officials and royal advisers of criminal conspiracy. She emphasized that she took no pleasure in revealing truths that would damage institutions she had spent 13 years serving loyally. The medical evidence presented by Dr. Harrison was devastating in its clinical precision. Chemical analysis of hair and tissue samples proved beyond any doubt that Catherine had been systematically poisoned over an 18-month period with compounds designed to cause neurological symptoms that would mimic mental illness. The sophistication of the poisoning protocol required expertise available only to state-level actors or their proxies. Detective Inspector Stone's testimony revealed the full extent of official obstruction of justice. Her investigation had been terminated not because of lack of evidence, but because it was uncovering connections that reached into the highest levels of government. Documents she had been ordered to destroy were safely preserved and proved that ministers had been briefed on the conspiracy while choosing to allow it to continue. Marcus Wells's defection from the European Cultural Exchange Foundation provided the missing pieces of the puzzle. His detailed account of recruitment methods, operational procedures, and target selection revealed a conspiracy that extended far beyond Catherine's case. The organization had been systematically targeting influential women across Europe, using techniques that ranged from character assassination to attempted murder. The financial evidence presented by Emma Thompson traced money flows that connected the conspiracy to foreign intelligence services while implicating dozens of British citizens who had accepted payment for their participation. Bank records, shell company registrations, and cryptocurrency transactions painted a clear picture of a well-funded operation designed to destabilize Western democratic institutions. The most dramatic moment came when Catherine played audio recordings that had been secretly made by Thomas Kingsley during his final weeks at the palace. Senior advisors could be heard discussing Catherine's elimination as necessary for the stability of the monarchy, while government ministers debated whether her death should appear natural or accidental. The reactions from MPs were immediate and visceral. Several members of the governing party publicly denounced their own leadership's involvement in the conspiracy. Opposition leaders demanded immediate arrests and the formation of a special prosecutor's office with extraordinary powers to investigate institutional corruption. When Catherine revealed that Prince William had been systematically deceived about her condition and manipulated into supporting her isolation, the human cost of the conspiracy became clear. Her husband had been as much a victim as she was, led to believe that his wife's absence was necessary for her health and the monarchy's stability. The international implications became apparent when Wells testified about parallel operations in other countries. The poisoning of Catherine was part of a coordinated campaign that had also targeted the wives of prominent political figures in France, Germany, and the Netherlands. The goal was to destabilize confidence in democratic institutions by destroying the credibility of their most trusted representatives. Catherine's conclusion was both personal and political. She described the choice between remaining silent to protect the monarchy's reputation or speaking out to prevent similar attacks on others. Her decision to choose truth over institutional loyalty represented a fundamental challenge to the assumption that powerful organizations could act without accountability. The immediate aftermath of Catherine's testimony was unprecedented in modern British political history. Within hours, the Prime Minister announced his resignation, acknowledging that his failure to act on early intelligence about the conspiracy had made him complicit in its crimes. The Home Secretary and 3 other cabinet ministers followed suit before the day ended. King Charles faced the most severe constitutional crisis in modern royal history. Public opinion polls showed that a majority of British citizens now supported abolishing the monarchy entirely, while Commonwealth countries began formal processes to remove him as head of state. His survival depended entirely on his willingness to cooperate fully with criminal investigations and implement radical reforms. The legal response was swift and comprehensive. The Attorney General announced the formation of a special crimes unit with unprecedented powers to investigate the conspiracy and prosecute all those involved, regardless of their position or status. European authorities coordinated similar investigations into the activities of the European Cultural Exchange Foundation across the continent. International reaction validated Catherine's decision to speak publicly, rather than seek private justice. The United Nations announced an investigation into systematic attacks on democratic institutions, while NATO countries began reviewing their security protocols for protecting political figures and their families from similar conspiracies. The media revelations that followed Catherine's testimony exposed the full extent of the disinformation campaign that had been prepared to destroy her credibility. Fabricated videos, falsified medical records, and coordinated social media attacks had been ready for deployment if her initial poisoning had not been sufficient to silence her permanently. 3 months after her parliamentary testimony, Catherine stood in the same Swiss medical facility where her recovery had begun, but this time as a visitor rather than a patient. Dr. Harrison had invited her to address an international conference on political poisonings, sharing her experience to help protect other potential victims. The legal consequences of her revelations were still unfolding. Over 60 individuals had been arrested in connection with the conspiracy, including 3 members of parliament, 2 senior civil servants, and dozens of journalists who had accepted payments to manipulate public opinion. The European Cultural Exchange Foundation had been dissolved, and its assets were being used to compensate victims of its operations. The constitutional reforms triggered by Catherine's testimony were equally far-reaching. A new independent oversight commission had been established with the power to investigate government agencies and royal institutions. Strict new laws protected whistleblowers and mandated transparency in official communications related to public figures. Prince William had undergone his own painful journey of discovery as the full extent of his manipulation became clear. His public apology to Catherine and his cooperation with investigators had helped restore some public confidence in the monarchy, but their personal relationship remained strained by the trauma they had both endured. Catherine's role had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just a royal spouse, but had become an international symbol of courage in the face of institutional corruption. Speaking invitations arrived from around the world, while human rights organizations sought her support for campaigns to protect democratic institutions. Sarah Mitchell had been appointed to head a new International Security Coordination Office, tasked with preventing similar conspiracies against political figures worldwide. Her military expertise and loyalty to Catherine had made her the obvious choice to lead efforts to protect democratic institutions from covert attacks. Emma Thompson's investigative work had earned her journalism's highest honors, while her friendship with Catherine had been strengthened by their shared ordeal. Her continued reporting on institutional corruption had helped maintain public pressure for reform, while exposing additional conspiracies in other countries. The European Cultural Exchange Foundation's network had been largely dismantled, but intelligence services continued to track remaining cells and assets. The conspiracy's international reach had been more extensive than initially believed, with operations spanning 5 continents and involving hundreds of participants. 1 year after her first press conference, Catherine returned to public duties, but on her own terms. Her agenda focused on transparency, accountability, and protection of individuals who challenged corrupt institutions. Her popularity had been permanently changed by her ordeal, transforming from conventional royal approval to genuine respect for her courage and integrity. The palace no longer held its breath waiting for crises to pass. The monarchy had been fundamentally reformed, with new oversight mechanisms and transparency requirements that made future conspiracies far more difficult to orchestrate. Public trust remained fragile, but the institution's survival had been earned through genuine accountability rather than traditional deference. Catherine's children would grow up in a Britain where questioning authority was not only accepted but encouraged. The conspiracy that had tried to destroy their mother had instead created a more democratic society, where truth mattered more than tradition, and where individuals could challenge even the most powerful institutions without fear of assassination or character destruction. The final vindication came when international criminal courts began prosecuting the architects of the conspiracy under new laws, addressing systematic attacks on democratic institutions. Catherine's courage in speaking out had not only saved her own life, but had helped create legal frameworks that would protect countless others from similar attacks. As Catherine stood before the International Medical Conference, sharing her story with doctors and security experts from around the world, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her from a dutiful royal wife into a global advocate for truth and justice. The cost had been enormous, but the alternative, remaining silent while others suffered similar attacks, had been unthinkable. Her closing words to the conference echoed the themes that had defined her transformation. In a democracy, our safety depends not on the secrecy of our institutions, but on their accountability to the people they serve. When we allow powerful organizations to operate without oversight, we create the conditions for their corruption. When we demand transparency and truth, we protect not just ourselves, but future generations who deserve to live in societies governed by law, rather than by those willing to break any law to maintain their power. The palace had finally learned to breathe freely, but only because a woman had refused to be silenced, even when silence might have saved her life. Catherine's legacy would be measured not in royal duties performed or charity events attended, but in the courage she had shown when confronting the most powerful forces in her society with nothing but truth as her weapon. The conspiracy had been defeated, but vigilance remained necessary. Democracy, Catherine had learned, was not a permanent achievement but a continuous struggle between those who sought power and those who demanded accountability. Her victory had been decisive, but the battle for truth and justice would continue as long as human beings sought to dominate others through deception and violence. Britain had been changed forever, and the world had been reminded that sometimes a single person with the courage to speak the truth could transform entire societies. The palace no longer held its breath, but it would never again assume that power alone was sufficient to silence those who demanded justice.